Well, today we are going to continue talking about Ecuador, and the topic of my presentation is related to the effects, both social and environment, of a development model that Ecuador is following in the last 50 years, based on oil exports. The relationship between an extractive economy structure and human rights and development. Well, I would like to begin talking a little bit about why Ecuador is important. Ecuador is a very, very small country in South America. However, as it's located on the Ecuadorian line, it is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. It is also an oil-dependent economy since 1972, for about half a century. Unfortunately, oil extraction is located in a formerly undisturbed area in the Amazon. That is why the environmental effects of oil extraction have been very, very high. Companies haven't used an environmentally friendly technology. They are using instead a highly polluting technology, so the effects are difficult to overcome. In addition, I think remaining oil reserves in Ecuador are going low. That is why Ecuador must lead itself to an example of a transition from an extractive to a low emission and sustainable economy. Well, you can see that the relationship between oil and development is not a friendly one in the international context. We have the theory of the oil curse, which essentially means that oil exporting countries usually, not always, but usually have several shared problems, like low and unstable economic growth, minimal economic diversification, weak social distribution and weak employment generation, high environmental impacts. And in addition to that, usually oil extracting countries have a very low institutional capability, a trend towards civil conflict, authoritarian regimes, corruption, and weak democratic institutions. So that's why I think the relationship between development and oil in Ecuador is important. Ecuador obviously is not the worst case. In Latin America, I think now the worst case country is Venezuela. But fortunately, oil reserves in Ecuador, as I mentioned, are low. We expect to continue being an oil exporter for no more than 10 years. And finally, given the natural endowments of Ecuador, Ecuador has a high potential for diversification to a service-based economy in the future. Well, here we can see the per capita GDP in Ecuador since 1950 to present. You can see that this is the banana period before the oil. As the country began exporting the oil, we have an initial very high economic growth, but 10 years later, we shifted to a very deep crisis. And we have a lost decade in the 1980s that continued in the case of Ecuador up to the year 2000. Then we have a second period of very high oil prices, which resulted in a fast economic growth up to 2014 and later the economy collapsed again. So as a result, we have a very unstable and low economic growth. The most important variable linked to these cycles of low or fast economic growth of crisis is oil price, and oil price is not controlled by the country. Here we have a map from a PhD thesis from the University of Padua, in which we can see in red the deforestation impact of oil extraction in the northern Amazonian territory. It's very high. Today, we can think that about 17% of the Amazon land have been already deforested, which is very, very high. And most of it has been associated with oil. Nevertheless, we have still the Yasuni National Park and other areas that might have a potential for conservation. Well, if we have a kind of global, brief analysis of the national effects of oil extraction in the Ecuadorian economy, we need to conclude that obviously oil is the most important product. It accounts for about half of the exports in the country, about a third of fiscal revenues from the state. Nevertheless, as predicted by the Dutch disease models and other models linked with the occurrence theory, the country has a very, very high difficulty in diversifying its exports. As a result, 90% of current exports are still primary goods, mostly banana, coffee, cacao, and fish products, flowers. We have in the last 20 or 30 years a process of reduction of manufacturing production. The ratio between manufacturing and GDP is going down. And even if we try to diversify energy production, it didn't work well. We have some hydro mega projects, but they are facing very serious problems now. Social condition, which is very, very important, and it's linked with the topic of this conference, environmental justice. Poverty is still affecting more than a third of the population and went up dramatically as a result of a COVID pandemic. Underemployment is affecting, before the COVID, about a third of the population. Now it's closing to 45. And social inequality is very, very high. It's one of the highest actually in the world. Latin America is the most unequal region in the world, and Ecuador is among the more unequal countries in Latin America as well. I talk about severe environmental effects that we were talking about before. So here we can see very a chart about the evolution of underemployment, which is the most important problem in the last decade. From 2008 to present, we have during the oil, when the oil prices were up, underemployment actually declined, by then went up again, and now the situation is more or less the same as the one we had 10 years before. Here we have more or less the same evolution about poverty and extreme poverty. Now, according with the current figures, we are about 40% of poverty in Ecuador, which is very, very high, and not very different from the situation we had in 2008. So the country is actually fluctuating according with oil price cycles, and we cannot see an important expansion in social improvement in social conditions. Now I'm going to turn to the regional effects of the model to the Amazon. But from this perspective, we performed a recent research, and we concluded not only that the Amazon, where oil is extracted, is and has been in the last 50 years the poorest region in the country, but also that oil extraction has a detrimental effect over local living conditions. That means within the Amazon, oil extracting areas have lower social conditions compared to the rest of the region. Here we have a social development index we estimated for all the census, the latest census in the country, and in all of them, both in urban and rural areas, the Amazon has the lowest values for the compared with the rest of the regions in Ecuador. And finally, I would like to explain that we calculated spatially autoregressive model in which we included several variables that can affect social development, such as soil fertility, distance to markets, percentage of intervening areas, and so on. And we concluded that the net effect of oil extraction on well-being, local well-being, is negative. That is very, very important because it demonstrated that other things being equal, the net impact of the proximity of oil wells in well-being of the population is actually negative. That is, I think, an important demonstration that oil revenues are not equally distributed. Part of them go to abroad, but taking into account only the part that remains in the country, this part benefits mostly the capital, urban sectors, but the local benefits actually don't reach the Amazon region or the oil extracting countries. Thank you very much. This is my presentation.